Hello, so our first lecture will be from Chapter 1, and the topic is going to be what is economics. And to talk about what is economics, we have to learn about scarcity. Now, what I do in this lecture is actually I pull out some material from Chapter 2 in the textbook. The author talks about resources in there. I like to put it in the first lecture. And so when you go to the Chapter 2, you'll be able to read more about the resources. But the first thing to talk about is the term scarcity. And by the way, these are the study guides for the exams and all the assignments. And so if you understand all these terms here from all these lectures, then you're in pretty good shape. But the first term is going to be scarcity, and the definition is right there. More is desired than the amount available. And that means that people want more than what we can provide for them. And a good example of that for people who live in Southern California would be beachfront property. Everyone would love to live at the beach. I would love to live at the beach. Live in Rancho Cucamonga instead, but again, I would love to have a place at the beach, and I'm sure everyone would. The problem is there isn't enough land at the beach for everyone to have a place there, and therefore it is scarce. And scarcity again means we want to have more than what we can provide, the amount available. Now, scarcity is caused by two things. One is on the demand side, and so here's your human wants, which is the demand side of markets. And virtually they are unlimited. People want to have more and more and more of things. I'm talking about beachfront property. If you have a home at the beach, maybe you want to have one in the mountains, maybe one in New York City, overlooking Central Park, maybe a place in Paris, I would. But again, most of us can't have all those things because there's enough to provide for them. But nonetheless, we want them. And so virtually unhuman wants, and combine it with addition, which is limited resources. Resources are the things we use to produce goods and services, also known as factors of production. A factor is something that's used to do things, and these are used to used in the production process. And your typical textbook would start out with your factors of production, which would be land, which are natural resources, gifts of nature. So that would be farmland, timberland, the oceans, raw materials, iron ore, the sun for solar power, things like that. Labor is you and I. These are our physical and mental talents. And then capital is used to make labor more productive. So capital, we have to talk a bit more about that. It is a produced resource. And so capital is a resource that must first be produced. And so it is manufactured. It's manufactured by combining land, labor, and probably some other capital. So when you make a hammer is a good example of capital. It must be produced. And once it's produced, it's used to help produce other items. And so hammers, computers, drill presses, oil rigs, trucks, satellites all represent capital. Capital, the thing about capital is that it allows you and I to become more productive. And so capital can be in a physical form, which is how you normally think of it, tools, equipment, computers, all that kind of good stuff. But it also can be in a non-physical form, what economists call human capital. And so human capital represents the training, education, experience that workers have and can improve on. And so capital is anything that makes a worker more productive. So if you give a worker a hammer, that worker is more productive. If you give the worker the knowledge on how to use that hammer effectively, then the worker again becomes more productive. So we have to be clear in economics that when economists use the word capital, and that word is used in this class for any purpose, it means a produced resource used to produce other items. Understand that capital is not a financial asset. I know out there in the business world they say they want to raise capital to produce things. The problem with that is it becomes confusing. Money is not a resource, by the way. Money is something that we being societies, invent to allow us to conduct transactions, allow us to store our wealth, it can allow us to keep track of cost and benefit of revenue and things like that. So shares of stock is not capital in this class. Bonds is not capital. Money is not capital. If I use these terms in this class, I would call them financial assets. So on an exam, if I say which of the following is not capital, I could have down there a drill press, I can have down there a computer, I can have down there a truck, and then I can have down there $10,000. and the one that's not capital would be the $10,000. Essentially, money is not used to produce anything directly. If you look at how GM makes a car, they don't use $20 bills to make the car. They use land, labor, capital. Now, financial assets, I'm not saying they're not relevant. They're quite relevant because it allows businesses to acquire the resources they need to produce goods and services. Now, the last resource is kind of a special one, and that's called entrepreneurship. And that represents the ability to essentially put all these other resources together, land, labor, capital, and then produce something. So these are people who can manage a company, they can start a company, they can raise the financial assets to acquire resources, and they usually have to be able to take risk. So risk takers are really the entrepreneurs out there. These are the ones who are going to quit their day job, put their life savings into a business and make a run at it. So that is something that a lot of us can't do. And so entrepreneurs are the ones who really move the economy and they take the risk. Okay. Now, moving on, since our ability to satisfy human wants falls short of the production process of the production of goods and services needed to satisfy all of our wants, much of our resources are said to be scarce. And so again, we don't have enough of these resources to produce all the goods and services that people want. And therefore, these resources are scarce because there's not, essentially, we desire more resources than the amount available. So this means that in the world out there, when you have scarcity, it means that whatever is scarce has competing uses. Beachfront property can be used in many different ways. Different people can own it. You can put a business on a piece of land. You can put a house. Again, there are competing uses, and that is a byproduct of scarcity. In economic lingo, that means trade-offs. So if you use the resource for one purpose, then you cannot use it for something else, and therefore you're going to be giving up something. And that's always the case when we have scarcity. Ah, that's my cat. Okay, back to talking about scarcity. So now, since everyone cannot have everything they want, then what can be done? So we can't satisfy all human wants. That's physically impossible. Therefore, we try to achieve as economists and in the economics profession what is known as the economic goal, and that means the maximization of the satisfaction of human wants. Essentially, try to do the best job possible in producing the goods and services that can satisfy the greatest amount of wants. And so down here we have a typical definition of economics. Economics is, first of all, a social science. It deals with human behavior. And that's why it's in the School of Social and Behavioral Sciences. And it looks at the social science of decision making, that's making choices, because again we have competing uses, in relation to the allocation of resources. How are we going to use these resources? And then the goods and services that are produced from these resources in order to achieve the economic goal. So again, economics is a social science of decision making in relation to the allocation of resources and goods and services in order to achieve the economic goal, which again is the maximization of the satisfaction of human wants. And usually I like to show a picture like this to get across the idea of why there is economics. And so I'll put this right here. And so let's look at our wants as being maybe this big circle right here. This is our wants. And again, I've said they're virtually unlimited, but let's just argue for right now that they are limited. And so this circle represents all the goods and services that people want. And then I'll draw in the middle a smaller circle. And that smaller circle represents our productive capacity. This is our ability to produce goods and services. Kind of messy writing, but that's our ability to produce goods and services. So you can see that circle is much smaller than the one out here. And that's scarcity. This is all we can produce, and people want all this. So we have to decide how we're going to use these scarce resources to essentially make the things that people here value or want to the higher degree. And we also want to make sure we don't squander our resources in the smallest circle, make sure we're not wasting them, producing things we don't need or want, and make sure we're getting the most out of our resources here. And so essentially what we want to do is expand this inner circle as much as we can to, again, satisfy as much as we can of all these wants right there. And one day maybe the smaller circle inside might be enough to satisfy everything, but that's not right now, and I don't see that happening for the next 10, 20, 30, 40 generations. And so as long as the circle inside is smaller than the outer one, there will be economics, because we have to make choices about how we're going to use these resources inside the smaller circle. Okay, and so I'll stop there for lecture 1, for chapter 1, and I'll see you later on for lecture 2.